So I guess that I should extend a very warm welcome on behalf of myself, David Morrison Love, my colleague Cara McCara Fuller, and all the members of Eugene to today's seminar. This is the third seminar in our fifth seminar series. And today we have Yvonne Roberts-Ablett from Welsh Government and Sunny Singh, who are going to share some reflections from research and policy on the first three phases of a Camau Dyfodol project. Now, the Camau Dyfodol project, which translates as Steps to the Future, is a 3-year collaborative project between the University of Wales, Trinity St David, the University of Glasgow, working in partnership with the Welsh Government. The project aims to support education professionals in Wales to advance practical understandings of progression and learning and coherence within the context of Curriculum for Wales. Using co-construction as its core methodology, the project brings together researchers, policymakers and practitioners to develop shared understandings of learning progression. The project's significance lies in its contribution to shifting traditional linear understandings of progression towards a more holistic approach that aligns with Curriculum for Wales' vision. Through collaborative efforts between education professionals across the system, the project develops resources and practical guidance to support practitioners in understanding progression and curriculum coherence. This work's particularly crucial as Wales transitions its education system from an accountability-dominated model to one that's professionally led, emphasising sustainable curriculum reform. Now, myself and other colleagues in Eugene have been fortunate enough to work with Sunny and Yvonne for a number of years on aspects of assessment, progression and curriculum reform. Sunny is a senior academic at the University of Wales, Trinity St David's, has extensive experience spanning government policy development, higher education and secondary school leadership. His interests include curriculum, pedagogy, educational policy and practical educational leadership, demonstrated through his work as a secondary school senior leader and his contributions to the National Curriculum Framework. Sunny's unique background also includes theoretical physics and mathematics, as well as experience in financial analysis, which he brings to his educational approach. And I must admit that I have been known to send Sunny some random texts at breakfast time when an article pops up in my newsfeed about nuclear fusion. Yvonne Roberts-Ablett is Head of Curriculum Strategy at Welsh Government. As a previous teacher and senior leader working across England and Wales, she's now working on curriculum and assessment policy design, having been part of the co-construction process to create Curriculum for Wales. Yvonne is an Ed.D. student at the University of Wales, Trinity St David's, and her research explores secondary school practitioner understanding curriculum design within the context of Curriculum for Wales. So we have two very valued and interesting colleagues who are going to share lots of insights with us today. Before I hand over, just to reiterate, the first part's being recorded, the question and answers part isn't. If people do have questions that they wish to ask following the presentation, either make a note of it, or if you would like us to ask or points to be shared, you can add these to the chat as we go through and we can pick these things up as we go. My last announcement, as far as I'm aware at the moment, we don't have any scheduled fire alarms, so we should be okay for Zoom so far. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sunny and Yvonne.
Thank you, David. And I do look forward to those random text messages about physics in the mornings. They are my highlights. Afternoon, everyone. And Yvonne and I will take you through bits of the Camau Dyfodol project. But before we do, and the Welsh Government work, before we do, a really quick potted history of the Curriculum for Wales and the educational changes, which I'm sure lots of you are aware of and have been involved at different parts and the massive changes that are happening in Wales over the last 7 or 8 years. As David mentioned, we begin by acknowledging that the significant landscape and education reform currently underway in Wales is at the heart of Curriculum for Wales. This is the major movement in in the Welsh education landscape and the changes of the last eight or so years. In this major update, this isn't a minor update. I need to stress this out. The Curriculum for Wales is a monumental shift in education philosophy. The Curriculum for Wales aims to equip all leaders, all learners with essential skills, knowledge, and experience that they need to thrive in an ever-changing world. Its ambitions are encapsulated in 4 purposes. And these are to develop learners who are ambitious and capable, enterprising, creative, ethically informed, and healthy and confident. This new curriculum naturally presents both exciting opportunities and significant challenges. One key challenge, which our project directly addresses, is the need to move beyond traditional and linear ways of understanding how learners progress. The abstract for this seminar notes the importance of shifting traditional linear understandings of progression towards something that's holistic and aligned with the spirit and philosophy of Curriculum for Wales. Further to this, the system itself is evolving. Wales is on a journey. As the abstract highlights, transitioning from Wales is on a journey, and it's transitioning from, and as David mentioned, an accountably dominated model to one of professionally led. It requires new ways of thinking about quality, improvement, and the role of curriculum making and assessment. Successfully navigating these changes hinges on expertise and engagement of our education professionals, our teachers, our school leaders, support staff, policymakers, and university academics. Here, there's a clear imperative to provide them with support they need. This includes developing new tools, promoting shared understandings across systems, and offering practical guidance. Ultimately, it's about supporting professionally led systems that empower educators and enable sustainable curriculum change. And it's precisely where the project like Curriculum for Dyfodol plays quite a pivotal role. The Curriculum for Dyfodol, as David mentioned, is a 3-year partnership between University of Wales, Trinity St David's, University of Glasgow, and Welsh Government. And it's to support realisation of Curriculum for Wales. The project aims at to help teaching professions across Wales understand and implement progression in learning, not just as a concept, but in practical terms that shape curriculum assessment pedagogy at every single level. All phases of work are characterized by genuine co-constructions with teachers, leaders, educational partners, policymakers, and universities. The emphasis on co-construction approaches that are manageable, sustainable, and rooted in local context. This isn't about external experts telling schools what to do. It's about working alongside practitioners to build capacity, solve problems, and share expertise, and making changes that stick and resonate with professionals' practice. It's also helping to connect Wales with this international best practice, ensuring the new curriculum is ambitious, coherent, and tailored to the Welsh needs. Ultimately, the project aims at to lay the groundwork for a self-sustaining system where everyone from classroom to policy level have a shared understanding, a practical understanding of progression and curriculum making and development and realization. For the next few bits, I'll pass you on to Yvonne, who'll give you a walk through the timeline in a bit more detail. Thank you, Yvonne.
Diolch, Sunny. Good afternoon, everybody. So as far as a brief history of Curriculum for Wales, it began really with a call to review the curriculum and assessment arrangements across the country, thinking very carefully about what it is that we were benefiting from, what was working well, and what scope we had to improve. And that enabled Professor Graham Donaldson to provide the successful Futures document that all recommendations were accepted by the Welsh Government, which kicked off then a process of co-construction with a real attempt to bring together practitioners, myself included being one of those at the time, alongside a range of educational partners across the system, international curriculum experts, as well as government, to work together to think about what that could look like and how that developed differently. And as we move from draft guidance to final guidance, you'll notice that one of the things that was quite unusual about this was that the legislation around the Curriculum and Assessment Wales Act was actually enacted at the same time. So developing guidance alongside legislation was something that was relatively unique to the curriculum in Wales. And colleagues of mine now talk about this being a real uncomfortable period. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on, about kind of challenging identities in different ways across the system too. So the result of that then is a Curriculum and Assessment Act alongside our national curriculum guidance that was first enacted in schools from September 2022. You'll notice in the time period there was a little thing called a global pandemic that really changed the way in which we thought about what substantial change really meant for Wales. And therefore, as a result, the then Minister for Education provided secondary schools with the opportunity to actually delay until September 2023, but on the expectation that that then was enacted for Year 7 and Year 8 learners, our 11 to 13-year-olds at that particular time. So having been through that period of rollout, we've had a substantial period of being able to support the system through a variety of changes and global challenges. And we're now in the position where from September 2025, our new qualifications that have been developed alongside the curriculum and our Qualification Wales partner as our independent regulator to be taught from September 2025, with first certification of those qualifications in 2027. But we have a series of variety of qualifications from the existing GCSE brand that we had all the way through to a variety of vocational and other offers through to 2029. And I'll hand back over to you, Sunny.
Sorry, Ron, you've got 2 more slides.
Okay. So as we kind of developed this work, one of the things that's been particularly helpful for us is existing legislation that was already in Wales. So the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act has been around for a number of years now and actually really helps to focus policy direction across the whole of the Welsh Government. And you'll notice at the bottom there, as well as this being a real ambition for the whole of Wales, actually the focus really is on raising educational standards as an underpinning of being able to do that. And as far as lots of various policy areas across government are concerned, this helps provide one cohesive way of being able to think about this. And later on, I'll talk a little bit more about how we've actually developed this around an understanding of what Curriculum for Wales means inside this space. And if we move on to the next one there, Sunny, as well, please. As far as the national framework for Curriculum for Wales is concerned, we have an online platform called our Hub platform that enables all of our practitioners across Wales to navigate this curriculum guidance. When it was first envisaged, it was developed in such a way that it would be online and iterative, a very responsive curriculum, but it does have very many components to it. That part of what Camau Dyfodol has helped us to see as a system is that it's requiring very many things to be held collectively in a practitioner's head. So if I can direct your attention to the right hand side of the screen there first, Sunny mentioned there that the 4 purposes really are the starting point really for all learning that we expect to be designed. And as we've moved through the understanding from the previous national curriculum to the current expectations of Curriculum for Wales, one of the things that we've noticed is how the framework itself is used by practitioners. And as we are seeing practitioners really embed this in the way in which it was first envisaged, we're moving increasingly from practitioners seeing this as things that are ticked off to things that are actually the living embodiments of the human development that we want for our children. If we then go over to the left-hand side of the screen, then there's various components that actually fulfill what that means for the 4 purposes. As the curriculum itself was developed, all of these things were developed in tandem, really thinking about what that means towards the 4 purposes, so that every other single one of those bits, whether it be particular areas of learning and experience where you might find traditional subjects grouped together, where you actually see cross-curricular skills of literacy, numeracy and digital competency coming together, all of those elements are vehicles towards arriving at the 4 purposes, with an expectation that our principles of progression that you can see in the centre there are the vehicles to be able to achieve that. So as we expect our learners equally to have a really and growing sophisticated understanding of a range of knowledge and disciplines and growing that sophistication of skills, we see those 3 in particular in schools as something that is seen as also relative to the previous curriculum. So our question is always, what is different? And the 2 things that we quite often see that make the difference for people to make that transition between the national curriculum and Curriculum for Wales is that we're expecting people to see beyond just content and think very carefully about how they're supporting learners to become increasingly effective, and also to use that knowledge, skills and understanding that they're developing to make connections and transfer that learning to new and unfamiliar contexts. So we thought that would just be helpful to give you an overview of some of the things that we're going to talk about this afternoon relative to the Curriculum for Wales framework.
Thank you, Ron. And I'm going to take you now through a couple of slides regarding the co-construction methodology and the work we've done with Camau Dyfodol, and then Yvonne will take you further on the impact of this in policy areas and with practitioners more wider. So there, as I talked earlier about the phases of Camau, that's just a brief overview of where we are with the Camau project. We finished phase 3, we're going on into phase 4, and where we started off with back in phase 1, looking at understanding where the education landscape was at that particular point in time regarding progression, and where we then moved on to co-construction of curriculum, how are schools realizing their curriculum, because progression leads into, or curriculum realization leads into progression, and then therefore afterwards, how do we develop and support practitioners to become knowledgeable others in the development of their curricula. And we'll talk about that more as the slides go on. So phase one of the Camau project focused on understanding how practitioners and leaders were thinking about progression and curriculum realization. Critically, it explored the role of co-construction in supporting curriculum design and wider educational change. This phase involved national conversations, national network conversations, literature reviews, developing early models of co-constructions. The findings in this phase highlighted that authentic collaboration requires time, space, and willingness to engage with complexity, as Yvonne mentioned earlier, and ambiguity. But also at this point as well, and further into phase two, different people's positions within the systems, their inner beliefs, their understandings of education philosophy came to the surface, and their interactions were then used in co-constructing the knowledge of the project so far. In phase two, deepen this approach by forming a formal co-construction group. This involved practitioners, educational partners, and researchers. Together, we used evidence from practice, research, and policy to co-develop resources and explore progression and curriculum realization. This phase demonstrated how dialogue, equity, and participation and shared knowledge building led to practical support materials and settings, enabling richer and more locally rooted understandings of curriculum realization. We then moved into phase three. This is focusing on building capacity across the system and supporting ongoing realization with curriculum. So co-construction activities here involved in the projects working with schools and support partners and education policymakers. Prioritizing manageable, sustainable changes and integrating daily practice. The iterative process meant feedbacking, learning, co-constructing resources, and developing capacity building for future engagements. So far with the Camau project, the phased approach illustrates that co-construction is about ownership and confidence building. It's not about a linear project where academics, etc. are sharing their expertise. Is actually working with teachers, working with policymakers to develop their understanding. So shifting from a linear holistic to a more holistic view of progression. And this is one of the roots of the Camau project. So in phase one, many practitioners and policymakers initially conceptualize progression in terms of linear steps or levels, often linked to age and year group. The Camau project surfaced this through engagements with AOLE groups, recognizing while the AOLEs were different in structure, it risked limiting flexibilities and depth of curriculum design. Feedback revealed that language around the principal progression was sometimes interpreted by narrow, supporting divergent and shallow understandings of what progression was actually meaning in schools. Phase two became more of a turning point. By forming the co-construction group mentioned earlier, the project enabled deeper professional dialogue and collaboration inquiry. This phase showed that progression is not simply a tick list, but interconnected, emergent process, and is unique to individual schools and contexts, and actually showed how schools develop their curriculum, their school curriculum, within Curriculum for Wales, how they develop the school curriculum, looking backwards and forwards to the national framework and the national guidance. This point actually raised a lot of discussions among schools and policymakers and education support partners working with the schools to actually see how they begin to understand this. And what was really interesting here, as I mentioned earlier, is that movement from a checklist, a sequential, step-by-step, a fragmented view of assessment to something far more holistic. And as I said at the beginning, something that is within the spirit and philosophy of Curriculum for Wales. Practical resource material was developed by the co-construction groups, and these are shared on the Hub website. And these are designed to help schools see progression, not about help schools see progression as growth, reflection, and adaptation, not just moving from point A to point B. The emphasis was on progression that is everyone's business and is woven in actually into curriculum development, pedagogy, and assessment. It's not a separate thing. It's not a bolt-on thing. In phase three, work focused on implementing and sustaining these ideas in practice. Here, formative assessment, ongoing professional dialogue, and shared language became critical. School and practitioners were encouraged to use evidence, learning as a springboard and personalized next steps, recognizing that learners' paths may loop, branch, overlap, or simply ascend a predetermined ladder. This holistic approach asks teachers and leaders to value each learner's context, needs, and strengths, to create environments where the progress is defined by what matters most for the learner's future, not just external benchmarks. And I think that's something that came up a lot when we spoke to teachers. It was asking them what is worthwhile in the learning that they provide for their learners, what's worthwhile in the curriculum and experience they give for those learners. And very, very quickly, it started pushing back external benchmarks or some requirements that schools were given. This then gave a better understanding of what does quality mean in the system. What do we mean when we talk about challenge and rigor and those sort of elements of words? Because those words were banded a lot, but actually getting under the depth of those things gave a far more holistic approach of what learning actually is. So this is, again, trying to push the idea of the holistic idea of progression, which emphasizes process over product and encourage professional reflection and priority sustained and meaningful learning for all learners. So apologies for the text, just really a brief overview of some of the key insights from the research so far. So what we've got here is the Camau it's sort of demonstrating a system change cannot be mandated from top down. It's really showed this. It's not a top down thing. It depends on genuine collaboration between teachers, leaders, researchers, and policymakers. Early findings or indications reveal that practitioners across Wales often interpret curriculum and progression differently, which risks fragmentation in practice. This has triggered the project to shift towards a process-based co-construction solution, including creation of professional co-construction groups and working groups. These groups that we worked through in part of phase 2 and with phase 3 of the project develop practical understanding and the approach to help teachers understand how to operationalize curriculum realization, progression, assessment, pedagogy within the classroom. This work also promoted deeper professional dialogue and reflection and peer support. Through the co-construction groups, the schools really began to support each other, not just as critical friends, but actually supporting them and inquiry and discussions. And actually the networks that were produced from phase 2 and from phase 3 led to further contact and collaboration from the schools away from the project as well. So evidence has shown that co-construction is not just a quick fix, and something that's come up time and time again. It requires time and capacity to build mutual understandings and respect. But the investment does pay off with more adaptable, context-sensitive practices and stronger engagement in the curriculum and the philosophies and spirit and the educational value that Curriculum for Wales is trying to promote. Moving forward, the project highlights the need to balance practitioner autonomy with national coherence and to keep curriculum change linked to ongoing professional learning, not just a one-off event. It's an ongoing professional inquiry, dialogue, discussion, and reflections amongst teachers within schools and across schools across the country. So the implication of practical understandings. So the project itself, the professional learning and co-construction activities have underpinned a major cultural change from viewing, as you said before, fixed steps of attainment to a far more dynamic approach of a learner's journey. The teachers describe gaining confidence to question, adapt, and experiment with curriculum design and to see assessment as a tool for challenging, supporting, and planning learning, not just for measuring outcomes. And I think this was a big part where assessment is seen more as something to use in your planning and to challenge and to support. This shift doesn't just rest on theory. Co-constructed tools, real examples, and networks provided that bigger picture of learning and progression, and that's actionable in the classroom. The work that we've done with the school so far has made it more understandable and made realization a bit more tangible within Wales. And the reports are available. I'm sure David and Carl will share the reports with you at the moment. I'm working on the phase 3 report, but it is from the words of the teachers. The teachers have seen a shift. For some teachers, it's really questioned their view of what they thought was education and what they were doing in their practice. Some, it has helped them with confidence that they're on the right path, the right trajectory. but others has really promoted the educational value and understanding of curriculum for Wales. As we start the beginning, it's not a minor change. Curriculum for Wales is a monumental shift in education philosophy in Wales. And throughout the course of the last few years, and as everyone said before, I should go into more detail, that this really does question people's ideas of education, to be educated, and their personal beliefs on education. I'll pass off to Yvonne for the bit now onto the policy implementation. But just to recap on this, the policy effects thereafter is a transition away from an accountably dominated profession to a professionally led system. Wales has come from, and lots of you are probably aware of this, of decades of a very, very punitive accountability system. Having taught and led parts of schools in these systems to where we are now, it is a monumental change. Integration of curriculum for Wales and supporting curriculum reform. And as we said, development of practical resources and practical guidance, as well as what's really come out through the course of the project. The staff, the teachers, the education support partners who've been with us, they are the real outcomes. They are the ones who really changed their views and have brought their understanding of curriculum for Wales and education with this. I'll pass you over to Yvonne now. Thank you. Yvonne, do you want me to stop the screen and do you want to present?
Lovely, thank you. I think you should be able to see that now. So thank you, Sunny. So as Sunny said there, part of what I'm going to talk through now is really what we're trying to do from a policy perspective to move what we quite often talk about being a juggernaut, really. It's a real difficult thing to be able to shift and move all of the system into one place. And one of the things that we quite often do is share that perspective with the school leaders and the practitioners that we talk about, because there feels as if sometimes there's a little bit of a hurry to get the job done, when actually that's not necessarily the way in which this is going to be realised over the next decade. And being able to just say to people that it's okay to slow down a little bit and to be able to really reflect on where they are is something that's really quite different from a systemic point of view. So what I'm going to take you through is just some of those different layers that are in the system that we're really trying to move. And as much as we try to move those coherently, I think we're very much aware that this is a long-term goal that we need to be able for our school system to be able to settle into this way of thinking, to be able to keep that as coherent as we possibly can over this the next period. So one of the things that we're very much aware of that Sunny alluded to there is around moving from a prior accountability system to actually thinking differently about the things that we want teachers and we want our school leaders to be accountable for. And we quite often talk about accountability is not the issue, providing you're accountable for the right thing. But part of the challenge that we've always found and certainly have been challenged in the system by is a thinking that actually we have some proxies for accountability that sometimes don't necessarily reveal the complexity that exists between learners within the system and what we actually want for learning as a whole. So one of the things that we're really trying to think differently now around over the next kind of 6 months is about self-evaluation and improvement. We've recently created what we're calling our education improvement team, which is a central government team that is supported to be able to work closely with our educational partners, with our education local authorities, and with also our various consortia regional options that we have available across the country. And what we're really trying to do is think differently about an accountability structure that quite often is based on competition. We previously had a categorization system that evolved and changed over the last couple of years, which really had created a competition culture amongst schools and amongst various educational partners, and the legacy of which has taken a while for us to be able to move. And what we're really focusing on is that idea of collaborative self-evaluation. How do we really ensure that we are collectively responsible for all of the learners across Wales and that all resources actually support that? That really then asks questions about the type of learning that is happening, the type of provision that is in our schools, and how that is actually leading to people being able to understand what it is that they're looking at, as opposed to potentially understanding that from proxies of learning through might be RAG-rated spreadsheets, it might be various hard quantitative data, and really trying to get people to think behind that idea of the faces behind the data that they represent. And as a result of that, we're really trying to encourage our system leaders and our school leaders to be able to engage in that process of peer review, to involve various expertise as well as various partners across the entire system, to generate an open culture of learning that really gets to the heart of what it is that's developing in our classrooms, and to really think carefully about the types of ways in which we actually talk to each other as a profession, the quality of the dialogue that really gets to the heart of some of the issues that we're trying to change. And as a result of that, we work collectively to understand more around the quality of learning that is happening, as opposed to just thinking about the learners and the way in which those learners are developing. And we do that hand in hand. So this isn't a ranking exercise of how well your learners are doing against somebody else's learners down the road, but how are we actually collectively responsible for that. So as we're developing that as a school improvement guidance, then we're thinking about that improvement framework that keeps the main thing. And that is around how we really support the progression of all learners towards the 4 purposes. And we really think about how our schools, we've had schools as a learning organisation and model for a number of years, all of those various component parts create the culture in every learning organisation across Wales to support that. And the result of that then is that we have an ongoing cycle of improvement and self-evaluation, that reflection is directly building into the improvement cycle. And that might be around 3 key areas that equally Estin, our inspectorate, is also focused around. So how are we understanding whether the vision in our schools, in each and every school and setting across Wales, is coherent with that national expectation around the curriculum for Wales ambition? And how is leadership and management of those things supporting those ambitions to be realised for the learners of Wales? That then has a component part of how we understand curriculum, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but equally thinking about what that means in terms of learning and teaching, not being about activities and tasks, but actually elevating that as an expectation around the quality of learning, supported by and really being underpinned by the well-being of our learners, to ensure that actually everything that we're considering really has that inclusion and equity lens that brings into our school system an expectation for everybody. And what we're then thinking about is, how do those procedures for collaboration and professional learning, how do they feed into that? How do various aspects of the system feed into each other, but always making sure that this is about the learners and the quality of their learning along the way? So this is something that obviously our school improvement framework is actually working towards, but takes quite a little bit of change to move from that position of where we once had challenge advisors in schools, challenging those school leaders to account for some of these aspects, to actually move into a position of genuine collaborative improvement, where people are willing to learn alongside them. And there is an irony really in some of the things that that Sunny talked about, that what the Camau Dyfodol project has really done is hold a mirror up to the entire system for us to be able to say, how are every institution in Wales, how is everybody in that collaboratively responsible for the same thing, and how do we support all learners to realise the ambitions of the 4 purposes in Wales? Now, when we think about that, then we need to focus our areas in particular aspects. So from a Welsh Government policy perspective, really when we're thinking about how we raise educational standards in Wales, what we're really thinking about is standards in what? What do we mean by standards? What are the types of things that we're interested in that's related to those capacities and dispositions that sit underneath those 4 purposes? So we're really focusing that around leadership at all levels, being able to really support every individual in our system to understand their component part in that collective responsibility, and to ask questions, meaningful questions about learning. How can we actually facilitate opportunities that allow people to develop that shared understanding of progression that isn't the hierarchical level expectation of the previous curriculum, but actually sees the holistic learning of all children and the holistic progression of all learning as being able to be that human development and that human growth? And how do we then put our resources behind that? One of the things that I think we're very much aware of is that the Curriculum for Wales framework in an ever-changing world has the opportunity to be flexible. And therefore, what we really expect is to shine a light on what those barriers to learning are for our children that actually are causing some of those inequities and well-being concerns that we see for our young people, not just in Wales, but across the UK and globally. And how can we have really meaningful conversations about those that isn't the same as simply tracking and monitoring attendance and behaviour figures and data and all of those things, but actually uses them as genuine indicators of the world in which that is actually shining a light for our young people. So really that's kind of where our school improvement, our bigger whole system is moving towards. How do we really start to think about this collaboratively, collectively, and actually have that shared ownership of that responsibility as well, for us to be able to understand what that shared understanding of progression is. Now, one of the things that Sunny alluded to earlier is when the Camau Dyfodol project began, really the challenge for Welsh Government was to support a national understanding of progression. And really the biggest learning point for us as government at the beginning of phase one really was the opportunity for Camau Dyfodol colleagues to really say part of this is that until we understand which curriculum we're working within, it's very difficult to be able to create a national understanding of progression. And whilst people have very different views of what that curriculum is, then actually that makes that a really quite difficult task to do. One of the things as we've worked with the system is to ask people to really think about the definition that we have in Curriculum for Wales of our curriculum as everything a learner experiences in pursuit of those four purposes. It's not simply what we teach, but how we teach, and crucially why we teach it. That why question has been really important, and Sunny said, and I'll come on to a little bit further, around constantly asking that question to practitioners, why are you doing what you're doing? And if you don't know the answer to that, that's something that we need to consider collectively. We need to consider that together. What that has actually done is enabled practitioners to move away from this idea of curriculum as content and the stuff that we teach in classrooms, to very much think about this as everything a learner experiences. So understanding from the moment they leave their front door in the morning to actually everything, that first moment through the school gate, their walk to school, the way in which they actually receive all of the information that's come into them, the way in which then actually classrooms are organised, the way in which schools are organised, every interaction that they have with a member of staff. And what this has enabled us to do is really challenge that idea of curriculum is somebody's particular responsibility in the school. If something is created, if a wealth of documentation is created, the curriculum is done. And how do we actually challenge that as an idea for people to be able to tangibly hold this concept of curriculum in Curriculum for Wales, but really think about that as much more widely than the content that they actually develop. And this is where we talk about this idea of moving from coverage to uncoverage. How is the provision that you're using in your schools to understand Curriculum for Wales uncovering learning in a way that is so much more sophisticated and so much more exciting and really scintillating for a young person to be able to navigate inside a rapidly changing world. And certainly this is something that's been a rallying cry to the profession that is making a real difference. Now, in order to do some of these things, we've put some structures into our system that mirror the co-construction phase of the Curriculum for Wales framework itself, but also keep that idea of co-construction alive. And one of those things is the national network conversations. Whilst we held a variety of national network conversations to share the work of the Camau Dyfodol project around that, then we also have a range of other ways. And this is our opportunity really as government to take some of those challenges that we have in the system back to the profession and really provide that collective ownership in a way that's practically possible. So the national network is an open platform. We have a range of conversations, whether they be online or in person, at various points across Wales, focusing on an issue that we're hearing as government is particularly challenging. So we explore that issue through a range of various facilitated ways and tasks, but the idea being is that we co-construct those solutions together, that it isn't a case of presenting a problem anywhere in the system to another layer in the system, but how do we all work together to collectively solve those problems. And we've had real success in the way in which these things have developed, and we've had a variety of national conversations around a whole range of topics and areas. And as you go through the presentation, you'll find a couple of QR codes that will take you to the relevant section of our hub, our main resource page, that will give you a little bit more information around these things. But what we've been able to do is share guidance. We've been able to share resources and supporting materials and socialise these in the system to be able to really bring people together to work for as many people as it possibly can in the system in the range of contexts in which they work. And really then what it's also done is enable practitioners to facilitate these things. And the aim really with this is to close that gap between research policy and practice. We're able to share things that directly have come from the Camau project alongside other aspects with the profession to protect that time and space for them to engage in that in away from some of the busyness of work, but also provide them with an opportunity to feed directly back into the resources that they will then use nationally and in their schools and settings, and also feed directly back into policy. And there's a few areas that in particular this has had a real impact in. Now, one of those is guidance. So we had a document called Journey to 2022, which helped with a little bit more of a detailed implementation plan around the roles and responsibilities of schools and school leaders, and also thinking about some of the actions and the practical actions that schools may like to take. As we moved beyond that initial rollout phase in January 2022, we published Continuing the Journey. And really what we tried to do is to focus on what we were learning at the time from the Camau Dyfodol project. And that focused on really thinking about purpose at the heart of what it is that we wanted to do, really asking practitioners to think about what it is that's worthwhile to their learners in their context. And we were very much aware at the time of a number of people using purpose interchangeably with the 4 purposes, where we had some situations where there was quite superficial use of the 4 purposes as a tick list of things that our children are doing, and therefore they are healthy and confident in a matter of a 10-minute plenary lesson. But equally, we were also very much aware that when people were articulating the reason why they'd made choices around their school level curriculum, that purpose was being done in such a way that it could actually be quite uncomfortable to say, I know my children better than you do, and this is more purposeful for them. So we really needed to challenge that idea of purpose, and the concept of worthwhileness really helped us to do that. And really to think about what it is that our school context is telling us and what we're able to develop as a result of that. And that then informs that progression. And it challenged the idea that progression was something that the system was going to be given, that there would be something that actually told practitioners, this is what you need to do in a step-by-step approach, because that challenged the agency that was very much at the principle of Curriculum for Wales. And what we really focused on is when we understand the type of curriculum that we have, that enables you to ask questions about progression and assessment. We had an awful lot of practitioners saying this is fine, we're okay with this bit, but what about assessment? And we really had to change the way in which assessment was viewed, as not as an activity, not as something that was structured. And actually, throughout that period of COVID, some of the things that actually practically happened challenged people's understanding about assessment design, that if you are designing curriculum, you also needed to be able to design assessments. And many of our practitioners recognise the fact that that wasn't necessarily a skill that was familiar to them. Quite often we'd inherited assessment tasks and activities. As secondary practitioners, as my background, quite often what we ended up is mirroring various assessment stems, question stems from qualifications aspects, but we'd never really considered, what am I interested in? What do I really want learners to be able to do? And what is that the best way of assessing that in such a way that helps them? And that then raised the question of pedagogy. How are we really understanding our practice? For many people, that was really quite uncomfortable. And we've had to create those safe spaces through things like the National Network to hold that space for them, to be okay with being uncomfortable. When we're asking people about why they show up in their classrooms the way that they do, their experiences of education, their own understanding of how that means, that can be quite confronting for the individuals that are in our system. But really what we want to be able to do is think really quite carefully about how we hold that safe space for that identity for our practitioners too. So when we think about that leading change piece, then what we're really focusing on is how various aspects come together. And as much as we really have that ambition about bringing our our entire system together at the same time. There are component parts that different elements of the system are making more progress in than others. That idea about what curriculum actually is, and therefore thinking about the offer and the structure that looks like, especially as we move towards qualifications, and also thinking about what that means in specific 14 to 16 guidance that was published at the beginning of this academic year to prepare teachers. And one of the things that we've really thought about is how the principles of progression provide us with a really useful lens to be able to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, that we talk about this as the circle. This is an example of one of the supportive materials that we shared. But that bit at the bottom there, those 3 circles, quite often when you talk to people about curriculum in schools, they're the things they're most familiar with. So our challenge has been around how do we get people to understand that curriculum is everything a learner experiences, and therefore that them as an individual is really important to support their development. And actually that learning that we're designing has to have purpose. It has to be really worthwhile to actually their future understanding and where that works, and how we transfer that learning to new and unfamiliar contexts is something that's practically supported people with their curriculum design and been really quite helpful around that. And I'll say a little bit more about 14 to 16 in a moment. So Sunny mentioned earlier about this idea of worthwhileness, and lots of the work around the Camau Dyfodol project has been about simplifying these questions and creating those spaces for the practitioners that were part of this to think about this in a safe way, supported obviously by the researchers, but also I think it's been really important at the various phases that have happened in the Camau Dyfodol project that everybody has seen that we're all in this together. So the various strands of this work, whether it be working with us at Welsh Government and other policy colleagues, whether it be working with our educational partners in the middle tier, those people that support our schools and support our development, or whether it be with working with that school themselves. And asking these questions has been crucial. One of the things that we've noticed that we really need to think carefully about how we support the professional learning of everybody in our system is that as we've developed and understood what Curriculum for Wales really means and what that means in a process-orientated curriculum, working alongside learners and not being seen as the expert in that space is something that challenges the school improvement space too. It challenges that expert role of people feeling as if they need to hold all of the information to be able to support their schools. And this has been equally an issue of professional identity, not just for our practitioners in the system, but also for those people that work with our schools, as well as those that work in policy as well. Because that idea about creating the right conditions and culture to allow this to flourish is something that's very different to the way in which this worked. And as we've developed this idea, throughout this time, it's helped us to be really clear on the messages that we've actually given to the system. And one of the things that we've really focused on is this idea about being driven by purpose. We've really focused on this idea about progression being a quest for learner development, of that personal development, that holistic and intrinsic value of learning that's really important. And therefore, that's helped schools to be able to think really quite carefully about how they think about content, how they actually think about what they bring to their learners when they are developmentally ready for that learning, and then how we actually stand back and evaluate that learning at various points using a really broad range of assessments to indicate that progression rather than actually define it in such a way that it curtails it. So as we've kind of really posed some challenges around that, really what we've been trying to do is to think about how our practitioners just ask some very simple questions about why does this learning matter? How does it actually contribute to the 4 purposes and get under the heart of the 4 purposes in a way that's not superficial? So when we're thinking about those capacities and dispositions that sit underneath those headline statements, how do we think about how the knowledge and skills that we bring to our learners when they're ready, how does that help them develop those capacities and dispositions in a way that's much more meaningful? And that's posed some real challenges to us because some of the things that then have been challenged to the system in Wales is that if we're not stipulating precisely the content for all learners, is that learning left to chance? Does that risk a lack of equity in our system? And really what we've tried to do is to ask practitioners to really think about their agency in that and to really think about their power and their training in that space as well. I think this is certainly what I find to be the curriculum that I signed up to the profession to do. And we still have a huge amount of enthusiasm. And this has been really tough. And despite that, people are really believing in that real moral purpose, that this is the way in which we want to develop. So our argument really is that by asking these questions about why this learning matters, is that we're really thinking about how that strengthens the learning, how it brings that learning and sharpens it in such a way that we're really quite clear then as a profession about what we're looking for, what development we're actually trying to do, and what development we want for those learners, and naturally see connections across that learners. There is no expectation that just by covering particular content or depicting particular content that actually everybody's going to pick that up and it's going to be substantial. Those of us that have experience of being in classrooms, what you actually intend for your learning within that time that you're with your learners doesn't necessarily translate into what it is that's been learned or stays with them. And that's really the idea of what we're trying to really challenge is how that idea of rigor, what do we mean by that? Because if actually we mean that it's really hard and difficult, how is that supporting our children? Or actually, are we saying that this has to be something that's really sequenced well, that's considered well, that is connected well, and as a result, that is far more sophisticated a proposition for what we want for the young people of Wales? And as a result of that, then, that's helped us to overcome some of the challenges and those criticisms in the system. Because when we talk about this idea of learning as personal development, nobody argues with them. When we talk about with people about this idea of the 4 purposes, nobody ever argues they're the right thing they want for their learners, but how they use them and how they treat them depends very much on whether they are thinking about that mindset of the previous curriculum and they're a list of things to be ticked off and proven, or are they actually opportunities that deepen and really provide those learning experiences. And as a result there, as I said, the choices then that are made at a school level become vehicles to being able to achieve that. And it's allowed us to really explain that, yes, we have a national expectation. There are mandatory and statutory requirements in there that are really robust and rigorous. But actually, we really need to think about how they're applied in a context that is unique to wherever it is that our schools and settings are across Wales. And that really has helped us to translate some of those aspects between how people move back and forth between the framework, is the phrase that the Camau project learned. So I'm just going to kind of run through some of those things now quite briefly around what that means and what implications that's actually had for some of the changes that we need. One of the things that Camau Dyfodol has helped us to really see is that the role of professional judgment is really paramount. And there's 2 aspects to that. There's ensuring then that guidance is absolutely clear on what it is that we're expecting professionals to make a judgment on, and that ongoing refinement of the guidance to support that is something that is a work in progress really, and a constant share of development. But also there needs to be confidence in the system. There needs to be confidence amongst every level that the professionals that are working closest to our children in those classrooms every single day have the agency, but also the tools to be able to do that job particularly well and with great confidence. So what tools can we actually support in the system around assessment, around how we make those judgments on learning as opposed to the learners? And how do we actually support that in such a way where we're not having a trek through content, we're not thinking about a range of assessments that actually provide a very narrow measure of a particular child at a certain snapshot in time, but how do we use that information and be really data literate around that information to be able to evaluate learning and actually think about that cyclical improvement to our curriculum? Because if it's genuinely everything a learner experiences, those ongoing expectations around the environments in schools, all of the enabling adults in our schools, and all of the various experiences that we create in our schools all have an expertise in shining a light on what that means in terms of curriculum. So I'm going to come back a little bit now to something I touched upon with 14 to 16 guidance. One of the particular challenges that we were very much aware of as a system is that qualifications could be a bit of a jumping off point for some people. We have a huge amount of concern in the system as we move towards September 2025 as to what this means for learners. We've had lots of findings come out of the Camau Dyfodol project that this has given great amounts of confidence to lots of our primary practitioners, but for secondary schools there's still some challenges around the way in which organisationally they work, the timetabling, the bell-bound nature of organisations, how you actually move up to 2,000 people successfully around a building in such a way that enables that calm environment that you want to be able to work. So what we found is the principles of progression have given a lens to maintain that as a 3 to 16 continuum, that what we don't do is see a 3 to 14 continuum and then actually end up with something that is solely focused on a bit of a 2-year dash that we've seen lots of the backwash effect in many other countries. So when we've thought about this, the 14 to 16 learner entitlement you can see there on the right hand side actually speaks to a number of the expectations that we have. We expect really qualifications to have opportunities for literacy and numeracy and support our national expectations, but we also expect a range of qualifications that encourage breadth. We also then expect that to be underpinned by a range of wider learning experiences across the curriculum. This isn't just what it is that children experience through courses that they take, but how does that 14 to 16 space actually give them the opportunities to really think about that beyond sitting exams and qualifications and certificating for things. So you'll notice that wrapped around all of that is an expectation about this around post-16 planning. What does that look like? And that might be in some of our secondary schools inside their own setting. It might be across a variety of settings in their local area. But really what we want to be able to do, and capitalising on that idea about increasingly effective as learners, how do we support learners to be really steering this ship themselves and to really focus on the way in which that works? So what we've been doing over the last couple of months is that a number of us have gone to meet with every single secondary school senior leadership team across the country. We put on school closure days, so we had our training days for each local authority, and we went to those schools. All of those schools came together and we facilitated a range of opportunities to hear really clear messages directly from Welsh Government, to also hear those messages directly from our inspectorate, and to see that joined up approach that we are trying to really focus in on, and to really go back to this idea of what does secure in learning mean in that 14 to 16 space, and how do we elevate that learning from coverage, and how do we actually support learners to have a breadth of experiences and really think about how that underpins them. And one of the things that we really noticed is that in secondary schools, in their senior leadership teams, quite often what we had was a person that was the designated curriculum for Wales person. And what we wanted to be able to do was really support them to understand that if curriculum is genuinely everything a learning experience is in your school, then everybody needs to have that collective understanding. So to what extent do people really understand the duties around the Curriculum for Wales framework? To what extent do they actually understand where they need to be in this space and how they construct learning? How do we prize those timetablers away from creating option blocks that fulfill the various mandatory requirements, but how do we bring that curriculum to life? And the other things that was also a little bit of a challenge at the time is on the same day that these were happening, our awarding body, WJC, were also working with subject areas to share with them the new specifications and to take them through this. And this is one of the resources that we actually shared as a result of this, to be able to bring that cohesion together inside a school. How can we support senior leaders to have meaningful conversations with their middle leaders and their classroom teachers to be able to think about this through a Curriculum for Wales lens? We were facing quite a lot of criticism around the time of qualifications are just qualifications. They haven't changed. And really what we wanted to do was to take that argument back to school and say, you have an opportunity to see those specifications through the lens of the previous curriculum, or you have the opportunity to see them through this Curriculum for Wales lens as a process of human development, that these qualifications and certification opportunities are equally vehicles to arriving at the 4 purposes in the same way as what you would have that in your 3 to 14 continuum. And what we really challenged all of the secondary practitioners to think about is, one of those questions is, how do you actually use your specifications? When they all landed on your desk, did you flick through all of the elements that tell you how they relate to the Curriculum for Wales? And did you look for the list of content that you wanted to be able to teach? And who told you at which point that in year 10 you start on bullet point 1 and off you go again? And these were some of the challenges that practically we needed to take to our secondary professions, because it's quite a shift in understanding, especially at this key point for them. And this was something that has worked particularly well by ensuring that we benefit from the idea that as a small country, we are very much able to take this to our system very much quickly. So as we move forward then, there's a few key elements that we have. We've created a Curriculum for Wales policy group that mirrors lots of the work that we've been doing through the co-construction phase. We have a group of 40 practitioners that represent various types of schools and settings, and meeting monthly, they're able to develop resources like I'm about to show you now. They are the facilitators of our national network conversations. Many of them have been involved in this project and actually many other projects across the country. And how do they actually support others in their local networks as change makers in their system? And this is something that's been particularly helpful to provide a practitioner view to government and to policy and our ministers at various points. The other thing that we've also directly done as a result of our learning from the Camau Dyfodol is to create a national programme of support for curriculum and assessment design. It very much mirrors the expectations of how the Camau project has supported the schools that have been part of it, but also think about how we can bring together and simplify guidance. So there's 3 elements to this that is fully funded for our schools. It actually brings together a range of our resources into one platform that is logically developed in a way that helps them to understand the framework. They are supported by people who have been part of this system and practically in classrooms are supporting that system, and then also provides a coaching opportunity that means that we're bringing in our middle tier partners to be able to support that school evaluation and self-development in a way that is much more meaningful and focused. And we've learned an awful lot along the way, and the changes post-COVID, the challenges that we have to recruitment and retention, the way in which we're providing ultimate flexibility as much as we possibly can for schools to be able to take ownership of their professional learning and access this in a variety of ways. And many of the resources have resulted in us publishing some very simple design activities that take people through this process of worthwhileness in a way that helps them to utilise the framework in a way that is much more meaningful. And all of these are hyperlinked documents that people can use. They can use as professional learning materials. They can actually use as stimulus points for their conversations. But we keep taking them back to this idea of how do we support whole school curriculum design within that national framework, but also how do we support classroom practitioners to practically do this on a daily basis. And one of the challenges that we found was in that curriculum design, where people were seeing it as content, there were massive amounts of mapping exercise going on across the country, but people still didn't know what they were teaching on Monday morning. So to be able to break down some of those expectations and to try and really prevent a bit of an industry created around bureaucratising the curriculum for Wales, we've created lots of resources that have directly been informed by the things that we have, and also how we tell that story. So rather than the case studies, we've inevitably had lots of the questions about show me what it looks like, and actually being able to challenge some of those ideas and say, well, we need to be able to tell your story. We need to be able to tell your story about where you are now, not the shiny example at the other end, because you will never be done. But how do we enable you to think carefully about being confident to share your story, warts and all about that? And we've got many case studies now that people have been able to say, yeah, I'm okay with this. I'm in a position where I can actually talk about it because I see this now as a process of evolution, not something that I've got to achieve. And Sunny mentioned earlier about some of the building blocks of all of this. We found in particular that our enabling learning guidance that was created for our non-maintained settings initially has been really helpful. It's been really helpful for practitioners to actually see the way in which they understand learner development, and equally the way in which they understand their assessment processes. How do they operate the same ideas around observation and noticing what those learners are doing to inform their curriculum on a daily basis? And these are the things that we're really trying to focus in on now, is how do we understand pedagogy and how do we elevate pedagogy away from tasks and activities to ask some real questions about that. So just to finish up really, you know, we've seen a huge amount of innovative practice. We've seen people in really quite difficult and challenging circumstances over the last couple of years, really focusing on this. It really is a high priority for how we develop this. And I think that's testament and credit to the way in which that's been brought along together with everybody and real ownership and all of that. But equally, we also see some real enablers. It's a crucial time for us now around qualifications reform. As I said, how we put that kind of culture around the school improvement space is really important. And some of the challenges that we're seeing that in particular are putting pressure on our additional learning needs reform is something that we need to do. And our priorities really as to where we understand that is, how do we now understand a cycle of review for the curriculum? How do we really focus in on those things that people are finding most challenge around? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't swamp the system with more detail, but actually create that balance? And we're finding at the moment around showing people rather than telling people as a concept of that is supporting professional learning and supporting people to understand progression in a way that's different. We've got lots alongside our national support programme, a big pilot project around comparative judgment that is looking at this idea about how we understand learning and being able to create anonymous assessment systems that get to the heart of professional learning as opposed to actually ranking of learners. And all of these things collectively together are starting to get to a point where people are comfortable with being uncomfortable and the change that exists in that system and that ongoing cycle of change. And as I said, it's definitely a work in progress and there are lots of moving parts, but it still remains probably the most exciting job I've ever had. So we keep going with it. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and David, I'm handing back to you, I believe.